railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. The crowd had gathered early. It was Tuesday, the 5th of July, 1910. The second day in a trial that had gripped the city of Newcastle. A colliery clerk had been murdered on the train to Allenmouth. Hundreds of pounds had gone missing, and a local man had been arrested. A huge crowd lingered around the court that summer morning. A lucky few had seats in the public gallery, but the rest would have to wait for newspaper reports of the drama that was to unfold. For this was the day the defendant would speak. This was the day John Alexander Dickman would tell his side of the story.
This was only the 6th murder in a railway carriage in the past half century, and it created very much a local sensation.
This was the first case of any similar murder in the north of England on a railway train. So it was actually a kind of very shocking thing to have occurred.
The physical evidence that the prosecution could present was actually very limited. The other evidence is very largely circumstantial, and that was the great weakness of the prosecution case.
John Nisbet was 44 years old. Married with 2 children, he led a happy, comfortable life. He was clerk and bookkeeper at the Stobswood Colliery Company, where he'd worked for many years.
He lived just on the outskirts of Newcastle, and he was a wages clerk. A lot of mines in Northumberland at the time, and his job involved making up the wages and paying the wages.
John Nisbet was an ordinary man. He was trusted, he was liked, he was respected by his employers, he was approachable and cheerful.
Nisbet lived at 180 Heaton Road with his wife Cicely and their 2 teenage daughters. On the morning of Friday the 18th of March 1910, he left home and headed for the office of the Stobswood Colliery Company on Quayside, the commercial heart of Newcastle. And there he was handed a cheque, £370, 9 shillings and 6pence, the wages for the pit at Widrington.
Nisbet did this every 2 weeks. He would go to Newcastle and cash a cheque for the workmen's wages. He would then take this money back to the colliery and pay this money out.
It would be the payroll for the whole of that colliery, probably. By today's standards, you'd think very poor security to just go on your own in a train with that amount of money with you.
It was normal for such large amounts to be carried in this apparently informal way. People didn't really think about the risks.
Nisbet cashed the cheque at the Lloyds Bank and headed for Newcastle Central Station. Nisbet caught the 10:27 a.m. service to Allenmouth. It was due at Widrington Station just over an hour later. The colliery was a short walk from there. But Nisbet never arrived.
At the end of the line, the porter did his usual routine. He went through the train, opened the compartment doors to check if anything was there.
The guard saw that the window in one particular carriage was down, went to close it when he saw a stream of blood and a pair of smashed glasses.
Nisbet's body was found stuffed in a fetal position underneath one of the carriage seats.
He'd been shot in the head 5 times, which suggests that the murderer wanted to make sure that Nisbet was thoroughly dead. There was no question of him surviving the shots.
The murderer must have been just fired directly into Nisbet's face as he was sitting opposite him or standing opposite him. And then when Nisbet went down, the other 3 shots must have been fired, 2 behind the left ear and 1 behind the right ear.
There was no sign of Nisbet's attacker and no sign of his locked leather money bag. But the police investigation was to move quickly. The 10:27 service had not been a busy one. A number of other passengers had seen John Nisbet at Newcastle Station and on the train, and they said he was with someone. One of those witnesses gave police a name. Three days after the murder, Detective Inspector Andrew Tate knocked on the door of number 1 Lily Avenue. John Alexander Dickman had a lot in common with the dead man. Like Nisbet, Dickman was in his mid-40s and had been a Newcastle man his whole life. He too was happily married with 2 children. He'd even worked for a coal mine in the past as well. But whereas Nisbet was steadily employed, the man accused of killing him had a more varied career.
John Dickman is an interesting character. He was middle class, middling middle class, but Dickman did not follow the tenets of respectability. He did not behave as most middle class people would do.
John Dickman used to be the secretary of one of the mining companies. So he was involved in the mining industry in Northumberland. But what had happened was the company which he was involved with had been taken over by another company.
He'd negotiated the sale of a colliery through a coal merchant called Frank Christie. And for this work in the sale, Dickman had received somewhere between £400 and £500 commission.
And he decides, instead of simply getting another job and settling down with the ambition of becoming a head clerk, to become a speculator.
He was involved with betting and horse racing, got to the stage where his income was reliant on him backing winners.
He's a character who is very clearly living in the shadows. He is sometimes successful, but it seems that particularly by 1910, he was having something of a run of bad luck.
Dickman was asked to accompany Detective Tate to the station on Pilgrim Street. He donned his coat and boots. His wife Annie was still expecting him home for dinner later that night. But Dickman did not return. At the police station, he was arrested and charged with the murder of John Nisbet. And 3.5 months later, he was in the dock at the Northumberland Assizes. A guilty verdict would mean execution. On the afternoon of Tuesday, the 5th of July, Dickman entered the witness box. He would face 2 hours of questioning, 2 hours that would determine whether he lived or died. In the summer of 1910, a murder trial dominated the newspapers in the northeast of England. A colliery clerk, John Nisbet, had been brutally murdered on a train. And another Newcastle man, John Alexander Dickman, was accused of the crime. Dickman's fate would be decided in a stuffy courtroom at Newcastle's Moot Hall. By the afternoon of Tuesday, the 5th of July, the prosecution had presented their evidence. With each witness, they'd pieced together the last movements of the 44-year-old victim, John Nisbet. Several men had spotted him at Newcastle Central Station. He was seen on the concourse, he was seen on platform 5, he was seen climbing on board the 10:27 train. Next to him, the whole time, was John Dickman.
The prosecution's version of events was that Dickman had boarded the 10:27 train from Newcastle and got into the same compartment as Nisbet.
There was a chain of different witnesses that would give partial evidence, and put together, it looked fairly clear that they had got into the same compartment.
One witness, Charles Raven, agreed that while he had seen Dickman and Nisbet in close proximity, he couldn't be assured that they'd actually walked together onto the platform. But the crucial piece of evidence is the evidence of a local artist called Wilson Heppel. He had known Dickman for 20 years. This man, who was a keen observer, placed Dickman in the same carriage as Nisbet.
Cicely Nisbet testified next. It was her habit to meet her husband's train at Heaton Station, the first stop on the line, and they would share a few words through the train window there, and perhaps Nisbet would even hand her his wages from the bag. Nisbet normally sat in a compartment at the rear of the train, but that morning was different. He was at the front, close to the engine, and he was not alone. Cicely could see that there was another man sitting with her husband. He had his collar turned up, she said, and his hat on. But she was certain the man was John Dickman. 2 clerks from another coal firm were also on the 10:27. Percival Hall and John Spink got off at Stannington, and from the platform they saw Nisbet still on the train. They knew the man and exchanged a brief greeting with him through the passing window. So Nisbet was alive when the train left Stannington. The next stop was Morpeth, just 6 minutes down the line. But at Morpeth, Nisbet's compartment appeared empty.
There was a plate layer working on the railway who went past the compartment but didn't see anybody in that compartment at all.
That was the reason he didn't get in. He didn't want to travel alone. He was clearly looking for company and so chose another carriage.
It was only when the train reached Allenmouth, the final stop, that Nisbet's bloodied body was found. He'd been shot 5 times through the head. and bundled beneath the seat. His gold-rimmed spectacles lay crushed on the floor beside him. Whoever murdered John Nisbet had struck in those few minutes between Stannington and Morpeth. And Morpeth was the station where John Dickman got off the train.
There were other dimensions to the prosecution case. What they had, apart from Nisbet's murdered body, was some evidence on Dickman's clothing that there had been an attempt to remove stains.
On his overcoat there was a large stain which had been cleaned by his wife and which the prosecution alleged was blood staining from the killing of Nisbet.
Today, it may well have been found in the material, but in those days, in 1910, tests for human sort of blood were, well, they had been established, but they were in their infancy.
The prosecution then moved on to motive. By the time of the murder, Dickman's bank account at the National Provincial was empty, as was another at Lloyd's. His wife banked with the Co-op and the post office, but there was not £5 between them. The Dickmans may have lived in a comfortable middle-class district, but their bank accounts told a different story.
We know that he has very little in his own bank account. He's overdrawn. We know that his wife has a limited amount of money, but what we don't know, what there's no information about, is the shadier side of his dealings.
Dickman's financial situation at the time of the murder was very dire. In October 1909, he'd gone to a money lender and borrowed £20 on a 3-month loan at the interest rate of 60% per annum. At the end of the 3-month period, he hadn't been able to repay the loan, and so he took out another 3-month loan for the same amount, but he still could not repay the loan.
But the prosecution case had its flaws. The gun used in the attack was never identified or traced, so it was impossible to connect a weapon with Dickman. And the money hadn't been found either. Nisbet's bag had been recovered, found dumped at the bottom of a pit ventilation shaft, but it had been cut open. Just a few coins were left of the £370 it had contained.
You can't prove that he was the one who put the cash bag down the Isabella shaft, having slit it open and taken the money out.
The prosecution case was very much dependent on circumstantial evidence.
There was lots of evidence on motive into Dickman's debts and his money, the fact that he needed money, and so on. But as the trial judge said, well, motive is not evidence that he actually committed the offence.
The defence barrister, Edward Mitchell Innes, homed in on those gaps in the evidence. He picked at the uncertainties and contradictions of the prosecution witnesses. He quizzed Mrs. Nisbet's identification of the man with her husband. Wasn't the man sitting at the back of the compartment in shadow? And didn't this mystery passenger have his face turned away? Could she really be so certain it was Dickman? And what about Hall, one of the clerks who'd seen the dead man at Stannington? He identified Dickman from a line of 9 men at the police station, but was he quite as sure as he implied to the court?
Hall cannot swear to Dickman's being the person he saw in the carriage with Nisbet. He says he is like him, but he does not want to swear.
Although Raven, Hall and Wilson Heppel had all seen Nisbet and Dickman on the platform prior to getting on the train, they couldn't confirm that they had actually been together.
The interesting thing is that the defence cannot do anything other than argue that there is not an accumulation of evidence that is sufficient to amount to a credible prosecution case. They dare not throw doubt upon the credibility of the prosecution witnesses, because once they do, they open Dickman up to being cross-examined. They do not want Dickman's dodgy dealings, his speculation, his gambling, all the unrespectable things that he's up to come out in any detail. So they have to rely on trying to say the whole thing is just so circumstantial, you can't possibly make a credible case.
The prosecution had had their say. Now it was the turn of the defense. Mitchell Innes called just one witness. It was time for John Alexander Dickman to tell his story. At last, John Alexander Dickman entered the witness box. It was the afternoon of the second day in the trial, the moment the crowds inside and outside the court had been waiting for. This was a chance to impress his innocence on the jurors, to show he was an honest man who could never commit the terrible crime for which he stood accused. But any slip would be fatal. John Dickman's appearance in court would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Defendants had long been barred from giving evidence. They had to rely on their barrister to speak for them. They were simply not allowed to tell their side of the story on oath and in their own words. That changed in 1898.
With the passing of the Criminal Evidence Act, for the first time a defendant could give evidence on his own behalf.
It had been possible to put in unsworn statements for a few years before that, but it was relatively new and the practice was changing.
The defendant had had a voice, could respond to questions from the jury, from judges, but now it does set up a presumption that the prisoner would speak in his or her own defence.
It was thought at the time that a jury would want to hear from the person accused on what their account of their story was.
Not everyone was happy about the changes to the law. Some thought that allowing defendants to speak meant that they would be expected to explain themselves, that the burden of proof would pass from the prosecution to the defense.
Sometimes it wouldn't be in the interest of the defendant to give evidence on his own behalf because his nervousness in the dock would create a bad impression with the jurors.
The idea that the defendant would not give evidence in his or her own favour in a trial was actually intended to defend them, so that in their nervousness they would not convict themselves, they would not perjure themselves, that they wouldn't give the jury the wrong impression.
With his wife Annie watching from the gallery, Dickman told his story. Unsurprisingly, he painted a different picture to the prosecution. He never denied being on the 1027. He'd volunteered that information to police. But he was not with Nisbet, he insisted, either on the train or at the station. He'd seen them, and yes, in the booking hall. He knew him a little, enough to say good morning, but they didn't speak beyond that. And they did not share a compartment on the train. The witnesses were mistaken.
What you have is a man who, by a mixture of chutzpah, charisma, and self-confidence, a huge degree of self-confidence. Believed that he could put a credible story forward that would convince people.
Dickman, he said, yes, I knew him. I bought my ticket the same time as he did. I was on that train, but after I bought my ticket, I went through the ticket barrier. I went off to the toilet. I was in a different part of the train and I didn't see him. So he admitted that he was on the same train, but denied any involvement in the murder.
Dickman told the court that he'd taken the train to visit the Dovecot colliery near Stannington. He knew a man there and had business to discuss with him.
He wanted to go out and talk to William Hogg, with whom he was having some conversation about sinking a new pit.
Hogg later denied this in court. He said that no such meeting had ever been arranged.
He said no, he wasn't due to see me. He didn't come to see me on that day at all. But he had been exactly a fortnight beforehand. So Dickman had actually gone on that train exactly a fortnight before, when the wages were also in transit, as if it was some kind of dress rehearsal.
Dickman did not claim that he had an appointment. He just indicated that he thought he would go out.
He got on near the back of the 10:27 train. Settling himself in the compartment, Dickman opened his newspaper and was so engrossed in reading it that he missed his stop. He got off at Morpeth, paid the excess fare, and set out on foot for the colliery.
On the way to Dovecot colliery, Dickman became ill. He complained, feeling very unwell, and lay down in a field for about half an hour.
He's overcome with illness, diarrhea, and lies down for about half an hour, he says, on his overcoat before making his way back to the station, where he meets a man whom he knows called Elliot, very clearly the dodgier side of his dealings, before taking a train home.
Piece by piece, Dickman rebutted the rest of the prosecution evidence. The incriminating gloves, they were too small. He hadn't worn them since Christmas. The blood on his trousers, that was probably from a nosebleed. And he had never struggled to pay his bills. He was not as hard up as his bank statement suggested. He simply preferred to keep cash in hand. Watching reporters described Dickman as alert, confident, and cool. But the greatest danger was yet to come. After Dickman's statement, the prosecution barrister Tyndall Atkinson stood to cross-examine him. He questioned the accused man on his relationship with the victim, and he pushed Dickman on his knowledge of collieries, of how wages were paid. After all, Dickman had once been a clerk in the exact same role as Nisbet. Dickman was forced to admit he did know more than he'd let on. He was beginning to look evasive.
He had a ready answer for pretty well everything, but they were clearly answers that did not carry conviction.
The more he was cross-examined, the more his accounts of having taken the journey for some particular reason to do with his business, which wasn't very clear and wasn't corroborated, didn't come over very well.
His claim to have been so absorbed in the newspaper that he went past his station, his claims to have no knowledge of the Isabella pit. They simply do not seem to have rung true with the jury.
His account of what he had apparently done between leaving the train at Morpeth and then returning home was very vague, and nobody could be traced to verify what he had said at all.
His account of the day of the murder was not very plausible. Dickman said that he had moved to the back of the train, and it was there in that carriage that he'd travelled. Now, when he was asked, he couldn't identify any witnesses in that carriage. He couldn't give any names. He couldn't say where they'd actually got out of the carriage. He said his defence was that he was confused by all the questions that he was being asked.
After more than 2 hours in the witness box, Dickman stood down. The case for the defence was complete. Early in the afternoon of the third day, the jury retired to consider their verdict. Outside, rain fell. The crowds, which had gathered, were chased off by the unseasonably damp and cool weather. But the courtroom at the Moot Hall was no less crowded. After almost 3 hours of deliberation, the jurors filed back into the room. They had made their decision. Dickman was guilty. He was sentenced to death. But all hope for the convicted man was not lost just yet. Dickman still insisted on his innocence, and thanks to the recently established Court of Criminal Appeal, he would have another chance to escape the noose. In July 1910, John Alexander Dickman was found guilty of the murder of John Nisbet. Nisbet had been robbed on a train from Newcastle to Allenmouth. Shot 5 times in the head. His body was discovered under the seat of an empty compartment. Dickman was arrested 3 days later and convicted at a trial at Newcastle's Moot Hall. But there were hopes he might avoid execution. An appeal was immediately submitted by his defence team. This was still a novelty in England. The Court of Criminal Appeal had only been established 3 years earlier in 1907. For the first time, it had given convicted prisoners like John Alexander Dickman the right to appeal.
Before the Court of Criminal Appeal, right of appeal could be made directly to the Home Secretary. It was in his power to grant a pardon or reduce a sentence.
And the Home Secretary and the Home Office staff were in a position where they had to make a decision when they weren't particularly legally trained, and it was very unsatisfactory. So it was far better that experienced judges should consider the appeals and consider that sort of issue rather than it being left to Home Office, civil servants and the Home Secretary as a politician.
Among Dickman's supporters, there was still hope. On average, more than 70 appeals a year were successful, with convictions quashed or sentences reduced, and Dickman's could be among them. His appeal was heard in London on the 22nd of July 1910. 3 judges, including the Lord Chief Justice himself, would decide whether the conviction would stand.
Dickman's appeal was based on the error made by prosecuting counsel. The controversial issue was the failure of Mrs. Dickman to go into the witness box and give evidence on her husband's behalf.
A wife could give evidence at a trial, but she couldn't be compelled to do so. But when the prosecuting counsel was summing up to the jury, he actually mentioned that the jury hadn't had the benefit of hearing from Mrs. Dickman as a witness.
The prosecution could not do this. They could not comment on the fact that she had not gone voluntarily into the box. That was absolutely forbidden by the law.
When the jury had retired, the defence counsel said that the prosecuting barrister shouldn't have mentioned this. So when the jury came back ready to give a verdict, the trial judge asked them whether it had borne any significance in their discussion.
The foreman of the jury at that point says, well, actually, we didn't think about it, we haven't included it, we've already come to our verdict.
These procedural irregularities can happen quite often in criminal trials. It's up to the appeal court to decide how significant it had been.
The Court of Appeal makes it very plain that Coleridge's behaviour had been entirely fair. He had remedied a very minor mistake, which, as the jury itself had confirmed, had not had an impact on their deliberations and their actual verdict.
The judge said that this had already been dealt with in the court by the presiding judge and could be dismissed.
The defence, conducted by Mitchell Innes and William Percy, decide to try to get the bench to consider it not just on a point of law, which was the point which Winston Churchill had actually referred it to the court, but also to open it up as a matter of fact.
Since Dickman's trial, new evidence had emerged that cast doubt on the guilty verdict. Percival Hall and John Spink were two crucial witnesses. They'd given evidence that the murder victim was alive when the train reached Stannington. And they had identified the man with Nisbet as John Dickman. But there was more to that identification than was revealed at the trial. When Hall and Spink arrived at the police station to view the lineup, they were asked to wait in a passageway. There, a policeman invited them to look into another room where John Dickman was being held. The two were then allowed to discuss whether or not he was the man they'd seen on the train, all before the identity parade had even begun. Police, it seems, were so certain they had their man that they fixed the identification. When Percival Hall was still unsure, they strong-armed him into making a decision.
The evidence of Percival Hall, this was all challenged, again, as not showing that Dickman was actually talking to Nisbet and in company with him.
The police had behaved badly, but it was plain that the testimony given by Hall was not crucial to the success of the prosecution case with the jury.
As in all appeals, when they're first set out, it seems quite convincing, but the judge did really say that identification was actually satisfactorily established. So the appeal court dismissed that part of the appeal for that reason.
All the defence can do is to try to bring evidence that Heppel is an incompetent witness, which because of the importance of his testimony, might have changed things.
Heppel, he said, was old and decrepit and couldn't be trusted.
But Heppel's eyesight was keen. His eye for detail underpinned his paintings. You could ignore the other witnesses. You cannot dispute and get over Wilson Heppel's testimony.
The appeal was rejected. A last-ditch plea to the Home Secretary followed, but that too was turned down. In government, there was much criticism of police conduct in the investigation, but Dickman's execution was given the go-ahead. On Monday, the 8th of August, Annie Dickman and her 2 children visited the condemned man at Newcastle jail. The family was permitted one last half hour together. At the end of the allotted time, Dickman asked to kiss his wife and children goodbye. They wouldn't let him. The family could only wave as the guards took him away. The next morning at 8 o'clock, John Alexander Dickman was hanged.
There were certain cases, and Dickman's was one of them, where it would have been better had the accused not give evidence on his own behalf.
Dickman's story does not go down well with the jury. His narrative, his explanations, they find unconvincing, not because of the inherent unbelievable nature of what he said happened, but I think because of his personality, something which does attest to the concerns of some of those arguing that the Criminal Evidence Act 1898 would not, in fact, particularly help defendants.
John Alexander Dickman had the chance to tell his story in court. He was calm, he was confident, he was not believed. A crowd had gathered that day outside the courthouse, and a crowd gathered outside the jail 1 month later. Dickman's story came to an end on the 9th of August 1910 with a short walk to the scaffold and a noose around his neck. He had nothing more to say.